And welcome back to 35,000 Watts, the podcast. My name is Michael Millard. I'm here with Keith Porterfield and Scott Mobley. Today we are continuing a series we started 2 weeks ago about our favorite rock documentaries.
So, we have the Doc in 82 that's bands that are unsigned and maybe never will be signed, and they're basically paying for like $10. And then we have Dig, which was shot 15 years later and was about bands that were kind of not at the beginning of their career, but they were still, trying to find their way. They hadn't broke big yet or whatever. The last documentary is about a band that is at the height of its powers. So it's a totally different thing. And that's Keith's choice.
Yeah, so for this one, when this first came up, I have not seen anywhere near as many music documentaries as you guys have. I'm just not a big film buff in the way that either of you guys are, especially you, Scott. But I have seen a few, and so I picked one that I like. It's called New Order Story, so obviously about the band New Order, and it came out in 1993, which was right after the album Republic got released. So they are pretty much at the height of their popularity at this time, and then also right on the verge of their first major breakup. They had broken up for a while after Technique, but kind of with the knowledge that they were going to get back together. They all just kind of went and did some separate projects and then, reconvened as New Order. Soon after this thing gets released, after this movie gets released, they break up, and at that point didn't know whether they were going to get back together. They were apart for several years after that before their manager, Rob Gretton, got them back together. If you watch the version that I have, it is long. It's over 2 hours because it's got not only a lot of concert footage in it, but it's also got a lot of their music videos in it. So if you just like New Order music and you want to hear kind of what they sound like live or see some of their truly bizarre videos, because they've got some of the most weird, bizarre, just kind of out there videos that you're ever going to see in some cases, you could check it out just for that. But their story is very interesting. I mean, this is the band that grew up out of the original band Joy Division. I think most people that would be listening to this podcast know that story. They put out a couple of albums. They had a lot of buzz behind them. Their singer, Ian Curtis, had personal problems, health issues. He ended up killing himself before the band really broke big. And at that point, a band can do a lot of different things. What they chose to do was to go on to change the name, to recruit in a new member, that being Jillian Gilbert, who I don't know if she was dating Stephen Morris at the time. They end up getting married and are still married to this day. But they decided to go on and forge forward even after Ian Curtis killed himself. Bernard Sumner, who plays guitar and keyboards, took over as the vocalist. Their early stuff, the very first stuff that they do, the first album, is kind of like Joy Division light almost. It really kind of follows the path that Joy Division sat down. But after that, they start getting into more dance music. Seminal moment for them was when they meet the producer Arthur Baker, who helps them record Confusion and then several other songs, some of the dancier stuff there. But they're into Kraftwerk at this time and several other kind of electronic dancey bands, and so those elements start making their way in, and New Order ends up becoming, to my mind, the perfect fusion of electronic dance elements and rock and roll elements into one band. I think they are better at that than pretty much anything anyone else has ever done in that kind of genre. This movie, a lot of it relies on interviews with the band themselves, also with their manager Rob Gretton, who I mentioned a minute ago, some of their producers. It's also got some other musicians who weigh in on New Order and their output. Neil Tennant from the Pet Shop Boys is heavily involved. Bono from U2 shows up in all his Bono pretentious glory, filming himself with a camcorder rather than letting the actual filmmaker film it and all this kind of stuff. But it's interesting to hear what guys like that have to say about the band. They are universally complimentary of them. But to me, really the most interesting part is listening to the members themselves give their interviews. And they do individual interviews, and then they also do a group interview where they're all kind of sitting around the table. And then there's also a section where they are all together and they're kind of doing a fake game show where they're kind of getting asked questions about their history and are having to answer it, and you get a little bit of the kind of band dynamic with that. But the way the movie is done is a little pretentious. Like each of the band members their solo interviews are done in kind of weird locations. Bernard Sumner's getting a haircut. Peter Hook is surrounded by cross-dressers for whatever reason. Jillian Gilbert appears to be by herself out in a forest somewhere. Who knows? Stephen Morris is in the studio. He's the one guy who is kind of where you might expect a musician to be. So, it's got a little kind of pretentious reach to it. But it is interesting to hear them talk about the band and their output, in their own words. And I think especially when you get to the scene where all of them are together sitting around the table. It's either before or after a show, it looks like to me. You also kind of get a sense of the dynamic of the band among themselves. Like Bernard Sumner very much talks over everybody else and kind of takes over and answers all the questions and kind of steps on everybody else's toes. And so you can maybe see why there was a little bit of friction in the band that ended up with them breaking up. You know, this one doesn't, to me, kind of have kind of the overarching story as much as, as the other two do. It's more just kind of a look at their history, where they've been, where they're going, a lot of their music in there. If you want to see some live New Order stuff, this is a great place to see a few live songs. One thing I think on the live songs that's really interesting is that early in the movie you get a live version of Temptation before they have cleaned it up and gotten it kind of in its final form that'll get released on Substance. Later in the movie they play Temptation again, and it is the more cleaned up, tighter version of it. And I think it's kind of neat to get to hear live versions of both versions of the song. That's pretty cool. But yeah, I don't really have a whole lot to say about this movie other than it's a good introduction to the band, the dynamics within the band, a lot of their music. You get to hear kind of the biggest hits, see some of the fun videos, some of which are interesting in just that there's the video for The Perfect Kiss, where it's basically just them in their rehearsal space playing the song, but it's directed by Jonathan Demme, of all people. So, they had some pretty big directors behind them on some of those weird videos. But yeah, again, this one, it came out in '93. It was originally shown on the British TV network ITV. And then where I have it, it got packaged with a collection of their videos in a set called Item that came out in 2005. So I didn't see it until 2005. But like I said, it was done and recorded right about the time that Republic was coming out, and kind of the band was at the height of their powers, but also just about to break up. So I think it's a neat little slice of kind of the history of the band at this moment in time.
So I have a few thoughts on this one. First of all, as patting yourself on the back in a documentary you're going to package with your album or whatever goes, this is a really good version of that. I really think it really kind of captures their personalities. I think it captures their essence. Yes, there's a lot of pretentious stuff going on in here, but overall, I really enjoyed this. I really found it entertaining. So a few of the thoughts I had, you said that game show thing is fake. Is that right?
Yeah, it was all set up to kind of get them to answer questions that this guy was throwing at them.
Okay, that helps, because every time that came on, I was like, what is this? Like, why? And the other thing is, like, I can't see at least two of the members of New Order ever agreeing to go on a show like that. You get, like, you watch, like, Peter Hook and Bernard Sumner, and you're like, these guys would never go on a talk show like this. What is this? So I'm glad to know that was fake. Okay, that makes more sense now. One thing that kind of bugged me a little bit, and this may just be me being overly sensitive, I don't know. I did not like the way they talked about Ian Curtis's death. They seem almost angry about it. And the little joke about who's the laziest member of New Order, it's Ian Curtis, that was awful. I mean, what is that? But so that kind of really rubbed me the wrong way. Then I wanted to address the Peter Hook thing while he is standing with those cross-dressers. I don't know this for a fact, but I believe there is a documentary from 1987 or 88 or so called The Decline of Western Civilization II, The Metal Years. It's a documentary about glam metal in LA and stuff like that. In that movie, Paul Stanley of Kiss is being interviewed, laying on a bed, surrounded by women in lingerie. I really think Peter Hook was trying to make fun of that. I don't know if he landed the joke. I don't know if I'm even right about that. But with the second that popped up on the screen, I went, he's making fun of Decline of Western Civilization too. So I hope that's what it is, because if that's what it is, it's great. If he just wanted to do that for some other reason, then I don't know that it works. But if that was a stab at Paul Stanley, then I think it's chef's kiss good. And then, my other takeaway from this was, and you kind of mentioned it, Keith, in a lot of people's minds, I think, Joy Division is Joy Division, and New Order is this electronic band. I think, most people, if you say New Order, what pops in their head is Bizarre Love Triangle or, something like that. But this really kind of shows what is a very logical and smooth transition from Joy Division to what New Order ended up doing. It kind of shows, you know, like you said, the first couple of New Order albums sound like Joy Division with a different singer. They're maybe a little tighter. They're maybe a little more, you know, better produced. But that sort of sound, and really that sound is Peter Hook's bass playing, but it sort of carries through that, and then they add in the electronic elements, and they add in all this other stuff, and it becomes, you know, what ends up being on Technique or Republic or those albums. I think it really does a good job of showing you the progression of that. And then lastly, I had forgotten how insane their videos are. And I just hadn't thought about it in a while, I guess. And is the one where the people are slapping each other, is that True Faith?
Yeah.
True Faith.
Okay. I'd forgotten about that video, but actually after watching this documentary, I went and watched the True Faith video in its entirety. I was like, I don't know why, it just kind of flew out of my head that these guys make really bizarro videos, and I went and watched a bunch of them on the strength of that. So yeah, overall, I really enjoyed this. Like I said, it's, you know, a lot of times over the years, you've bought, you know, some greatest hits package or some box set that had one of these puff piece documentaries in it. They're usually pretty bad, but this one was very entertaining and very well done, I thought, even with all its, you know, pretension.
It's interesting that you mentioned the discussion around Ian Curtis and his death. I thought in particular that Tony Wilson, who is the founder of Factory Records and the Hacienda, which is the club that New Order was involved with, which ended up, you know, kind of bankrupting them or at least sucking a lot of their money out. But anyway, I thought Tony Wilson and Peter Hook in particular seemed really bitter about Ian Curtis's suicide. I think if you were to ask either of those guys if they were being honest, I think they'd tell you that they were very upset about it, because they both come off as being pretty bitter about the whole thing.
And I think that's a fair emotion to have. You know, if you believed that this band and that incarnation was going somewhere, and many people think they would have, that Joy Division would have been huge if Ian Curtis hadn't killed himself. And you're in that band, I can see a bitterness being there. But even if this is just me, even if I felt that way, if someone pointed a camera at my face, I don't think I'd say it. And it was just weird to me that they were so open about the fact that they were angry at this guy who, you know, at that time had killed himself almost 20 years ago, right? No, like 15 years ago.
Yeah.
You know, and they're still so angry at him about it. You know, it's kind of nuts to me, but that just really, I don't get irked when I watch movies like that too often. And that really kind of set me back. I was like, why are they so, and to make a joke about it, I think was really where it got me kind of rubbed the wrong way, but it is what it is. They obviously feel the way they feel. They're entitled to that. It's just me.
So, you know, there's a moment in the film where they're talking about they don't do interviews, and the reason they're known for not doing interviews, and the reason they didn't want to is because they'd be asked two questions, you know, about why did he kill himself and how do you feel about it, you know, and they didn't want to keep talking about it. One thing that I thought when I heard that joke was just, wow, we're finally kind of getting to see these guys like really come out of the shadow of this suicide that has been this like dark fucking cloud that's just hung over this band forever, and everybody wants to keep bringing up this guy who doesn't exist anymore and who is not part of what this band became. And to me, I also think that, you know, these are guys who spent a lot of time together, and dark humor is kind of a way to deal with stuff. So it didn't strike me, I think, as maybe as rude or as out of place as it might. And I guess it just kind of depends on a lot of things. Like I think as we're seeing right now, one person could hear that and just be like, God, what are they? That's the most out of pocket. Like, why would you ever say that? To me, it was like, you know, someone who's kind of talking about their best friend from 15 years ago and now has kind of got to a place where he can joke about it maybe. And maybe the humor is how they dealt with it. And so that was kind of how I took that.
I'm gonna say this, and maybe this is it. I don't know. Like I kind of agree with you. Like sometimes, you know, 15 years later, humor is the way to deal with that and stuff like that. And like I said, these guys were way closer to it than I was. I think maybe, and this is just a psychological thing that's in the back of my brain somewhere. When you listen to Joy Division, you can, honest to God, hear the pain in Ian Curtis's voice, and how what a miserable person he was, and what a depressed person he was. It's so there. It really kind of rips through you when you listen to that band. And so I think maybe my brain is putting those things together and going, don't make fun of the sad little guy, even though he's been gone for 15 years. I still hear his voice singing, and some of the clips they showed in that movie, you can just see it. The guy, how could this have gone any other way? People talk about Nirvana and, In Utero being like this kind of long suicide note, and in a lot of ways it is. If you think that's a suicide note, listen to Closer by Joy Division. That, how those guys, you want to say, how did those guys not see it coming? But they, hindsight's 2020, obviously. They thought he was just really good at writing depressing songs. But yeah, so I think that's maybe it, is that in my mind, because I didn't know the guy, I didn't, ever interact with him, my interactions with him are those songs. And when somebody says something like that, it's kind of dark and mean, I hear that voice in those songs and go, yeah, don't do that to that guy, but you're probably right. These guys actually knew him. They had to get over it. Maybe that's the way of dealing with it. That's fair.
I think that's hinted at. So if you're into New Order and Joy Division, and for some reason you haven't seen this, there's a fictional / nonfiction movie called 24-Hour Party People. That's also based on this story of Joy Division and New Order, and also like Happy Mondays and the Factory Records. You see a little bit of the non-stage, in a studio recording Ian Curtis, and a little bit of the interaction theoretically, obviously fictionalized, but I think maybe that was what helped me contextualize kind of their relationship as being friends from a young age who happen to make these records together. And so that's how they see Ian, not as you and I and Keith see Ian Curtis as this guy who clearly was one of the most depressed people who've ever, vocalized on an album. And it just is like so obvious in hindsight that something was going to happen like that, if not sooner than later. My guess is those guys didn't see it that way exactly, because he was someone they spent actual time with, just drinking beers and going out and whatnot. So I kind of tried to contextualize it that way. This documentary is really interesting to me for a couple of reasons. One is I think it's very British. It's very tongue-in-cheek, which is true of New Order in general in a lot of ways. I think it really does a great job of bringing out like those sides of the personalities, like you were saying, and putting Bernard Sumner in the barber's chair and whatever was going on with Peter Hook. I do see the parallel directly between the Paul Stanley interview and In Decline of Western Civilization. I think also right before they show him for the first time, he mentions being seen as like a womanizing or a woman chaser. There's a little line that he says something about that's the perception of him, and then just like 30 seconds later you see him for the first time in that setup. Yeah. So I don't know, I think it could be both, that I guess maybe all of his interview setups were kind of meant to play up this aspect of the personality of this person that you're supposed to, know. I'm not exactly sure what the haircut on Bernard Sumner is supposed to represent. The other ones are a little more obvious. I think Peter Hook was trying to play up this, true or not true, this aspect of his personality that had become legend, if you want to call it that. But I think he did it in a way, if he wasn't trying to mimic the Paul Stanley interview, he nailed it anyway. So yeah. Might as well take credit for it, because that's exactly what first thing that came to my mind, because that's just a classic. The other thing about the documentary and having gone through this process as a director is, especially if you have producers and a team that's working around you, you have all this pressure to kind of like to find a solve, as they say, for just, we don't want to do this rote, head and shoulder interviews kind of thing. How do we make this interesting? How do we make it different? If you've seen 35,000 Watts, you'll see that I don't really give into that temptation, and it's a very straightforward film, because I didn't feel the need to do that in my film, and I didn't want to do that. But I think in a different situation, I might also, kind of push those boundaries a little bit more for if it was a different topic, for a different type of doc and so speaking specifically about like the game show, okay, how can we put these guys in a different setup that gets them a little off their game? They're not just, it's not just the Q&A. They had an audience that seemed to be made up of people that were kind of in their orbit, because like Rob is in the audience, Tony Wilson later joins the audience, so it's hard to tell exactly who the audience is there, but it seemed kind of like part of their entourage, and then maybe some people they found on the street, I don't know, but small audience. But that's a way to get, it's like Hot Ones on YouTube, where they're eating the hot chicken wings. It's a way to get your subject a little bit out of their comfort zone, so that they're willing to say something maybe they wouldn't say in a Q&A. And it obviously works pretty well because Peter Hook makes a really out of pocket joke about the death of his friend that you wouldn't see coming, and I think that's kind of what came from that. I don't know if he says that in just a straight ahead, head and shoulders Q&A type interview. I think putting them in that situation got them a little more likely to say that, just like having them around a table invites more conversation, and like Keith said, it gives you more insight into their interpersonal dynamic a lot. You notice they're drinking wine. That's another way to get your subject to kind of open up a little bit. And we shot a moment like that with the KTXT crew in Dallas. So we shot, we have interviews with 4 guys who proceeded all of us as station managers at KTXT, and we actually interviewed them all in the same building at the same time, essentially back to back to back to back. So then they all came back after their interviews, and we had pizza and beer, and we recorded another hour out on the terrace of this building in downtown Dallas of the 4 of them chatting about KTXT and stuff. It's not in the film because it didn't fit exactly what I wanted to do, and the sound quality was rough, and the camera angles were tougher with what we were trying to do, and it just didn't really work. But yeah, what you're seeing, I think, in New Order is some really good ideas and some really well done interplay between the straightforward interviews and these other ways of getting them on their back feet a little bit, getting them out of their comfort zone, getting them to say things maybe they wouldn't otherwise say, or like Keith was again pointing out, when you see how Bernard Sumner interacts with the other band members, you can kind of see that even in that scenario where he probably was on his best behavior, a little prickly, a little, like you said, stepping on toes, maybe just a little bit, like you felt just a little tiny bit of tension there. That's what I liked about this documentary, is they did it in interesting ways that made the story more interesting. I actually watched it on YouTube, so I also had the benefit of seeing some comments of what other people thought about it. The narrator and the narration is apparently very, very polarizing. So they have a famous actress whose name escaped me. I had it written down, but I don't have my note right in front of me, who does a very theatrical, shall we say, narration.
Yes, she does.
It's almost comical. Like I almost thought that was intentionally comical, but maybe not.
It's over the top for sure. I don't think you could watch that without it being over the top. You have to go back to 93, and that kind of thing maybe wasn't as overdone. So would it have felt that way if we'd seen it in 93? Maybe, because it is pretty over the top.
Yeah, it's way
nowadays you'd call it ASMR, I think, because she's like right on the mic, and you're hearing every breath, and she's enunciating every word, but she's really hitting the drama and the gravitas of everything, and that's juxtaposed with like the game show thing. So I think they had to be a little tongue in cheek with that. But I think they were maybe trying to have their cake and eat it too. Like maybe they were trying to have a little of that gravitas, but also realizing that no one was really going to fall for it. I don't know how much of it was put on or how much of it, but it's very, among the YouTube commentariat, it's very polarizing to say the least.
I'll have to go back and check that out.
Yeah, not the greatest group of film aficionados maybe to weigh in on that, but people had feelings about it, I'll put it that way. So that's another interesting aspect of it. But overall, yeah, super enjoyable. I must have seen like kind of a stripped down version that they did maybe for a TV broadcast or something, because it came in at like 54 minutes and it had all the music I think removed, because the version I saw didn't really have a lot of live stuff or no full videos. It was just kind of the documentary part of it. So now I kind of want to go back and see how maybe it was supposed to be put together or what. But I don't know if both versions are available. I thought I looked a little bit, but I may have watched the wrong one or like a stripped down version of it. But I think it had all the other elements probably still in place.
The one I watched was also 54 minutes or something like that. So I think that's what's available out there, because I looked for the whole thing too and I couldn't find it. So.
That's interesting to me, because my chief complaint about it, I enjoyed it, and I'm a big New Order fan, so obviously I liked hearing all the music. But my chief complaint about it was that by incorporating all the music and the music videos and everything, I thought there was a lot of aspects of their story that got a little short shrift in it. Like you got to talk to Arthur Baker for just a little bit, but I don't think they really went into how much of an influence he was when they were kind of making that shift into electronic music. And you talk to Peter Seville at least a little bit and kind of touch on the obtuse nature of their covers and the way that he wanted to fashion an image for them, because they weren't really doing it themselves. But you don't go in depth into that. And I thought that it had a lot of that. I thought they have got such a unique and kind of interesting story. Same thing with Tony Wilson in the Hacienda. I mean, that is a big chapter of their career and their story, but it's really only touched on in the documentary. And knowing now that, you know, if you strip all the music out and it cuts it down to 55 minutes or whatever it is, it seems to me like the better choice might have been not to put a lot of that music in there, those videos and that kind of thing, and kind of flesh some of those stories out. And that was my only complaint about it, is that you're talking about a band that's got a very unique, very interesting story and history with a lot of little kind of strange nuggets and aspects in there. And most of that stuff does get touched on, but none of it really gets fleshed out. And that would be kind of the one thing about it that I didn't really, I don't want to say I didn't enjoy it because of that. I enjoyed it, but I would like to have seen those stories fleshed out a little more than they were.
I could have seen definitely more of the producers that, like you said, steered them, you know, into the sound that became the Bizarre Love Triangle Blue Monday sound, and then when they really embraced like the Ibiza sound that kind of informed Technique and to some degree Republic. Like, yeah, those producers are in there, but there's not a lot of time. And then you could make a whole documentary about Peter Seville and his influence, you know, not just on New Order, but some other bands as well. But yeah, because I mean, they kind of, like you said, they touch on it, but the iconography of those album and single covers is etched in anybody's brain that was, you know, into dance music or into 12-inch singles or in college radio, because we all had, you know, all of that on vinyl. And knowing more about kind of that interaction, it was kind of funny hearing the interaction that Peter Seville did let on of, like, you know, sometimes they would love it and sometimes they wouldn't, and sometimes it was like they'd say they hated it but it was already on sale, so it was way too late you know, to do anything about it. Like, that was cool. So I could have watched at least another 30 minutes of just kind of the vibe they had going, and I didn't realize that there was a longer version that just had music. But yeah, I agree. I think 20-30 more minutes of that would have played well.
I agree as well, that I think there is a fleshed out version of this that maybe gives you a little more insight and stuff like that. I just wanted, before we wrap up on this one, I wanted to, first of all, piggyback your recommendation of 24-Hour Party People. That's a fantastic movie. And if you're interested in this, the sort of Manchester scene of the late 70s and stuff like that, and like, you know, these clubs and these promoters and all these people, Factory Records, all of that, 24-Hour Party People is a fantastic movie. It's really good. I think I was trying to look it up and I couldn't find it. I think there is a documentary about that as well. I want to say 24-Hour Party People was based on this documentary, but I can't back that up, so don't quote me on that. The other thing I wanted to throw out there, though, if you are interested in this story, particularly the Joy Division part of it, not the New Order part, there is a narrative film about that called Control. Came out in 2007. It's the story of Ian Curtis and Joy Division. It is a fantastic movie. I cannot praise it any higher. It's a wonderful movie. I don't know why it didn't really find an audience here. It was very popular in Europe, but didn't really do that well here. But it's a great film. And Sam Riley, the actor that plays Ian Curtis in it, is just a magnificent performance. And if you're like me and you kind of have this vision of Ian Curtis in your head from videos and music and whatever, I think this guy just really nailed it. And so that's one I would recommend very highly. It's called Control.
Yeah, very cool. I'll have to check that out. Yeah, I don't think that somehow slipped by me. I don't think I've ever even heard of that.
I don't think it was marketed very well here at all. And I think they just thought, well, Joy Division was never really a thing in the States, so we're not going to bother.
The Joy Division, the band, had the same problem.
Yeah. So they kind of, I think they missed an opportunity here to kind of push it, because it really is a great, like, if it had been marketed correctly in the States, it would have been like an Oscar contender. It's that good of a movie.
Yeah, check that out. And for sure, I think all three of us will sign off on 24-Hour Party People as well, being just
absolutely
really, really enjoyable.
Very insightful and a ton of fun, that movie.
It's so much fun.
Yeah.
Steve Coogan plays Tony Wilson, and just like right from the get-go, that first scene where he's flying in the glider and you kind of are trying to get a feel for what's going on, and then he breaks the fourth wall about 2 or 3 minutes into the film, and from then on you're hooked, because you're like, oh my god, this is going to be good.
That movie's a blast. And it's a very interesting story, and it's well told and all of that stuff too. But yeah, don't think you're going to be doing any homework on that one. It's a fun movie.
If you have time to watch another doc, you can watch 35,000 Watts, The Story of College Radio, also a music documentary available now on Amazon Prime Video and Google Play. Thank you, Keith Porterfield. Thank you, Scott Mobley, for joining me on this edition, and come back next time for 35,000 Watts, the podcast.